So when you look at the really unique, bizarre things humans have come up with, ranging from cave paintings to Snapchats and everything in between, probably the most unique and universal thing we've come up with is this religion business. When you talk about symbolic, metaphorical thinking, essentially there has been no culture on earth that has not invented some form of what could be termed meta-magical thinking, attributing things that cannot be seen, faith-based belief systems, things of that sort. It's universal. 95% of people believe in some sort of omnipotent something or other out there. Every culture out there has it. People have endlessly speculated about the evolution of religiosity. And at least in terms of westernized religions, it makes perfect sense why they've evolved, because they're wonderful mechanisms for reducing stress. It is an awful, terrifying world out there where bad things happen and we're all going to die eventually. And believing that there is something, someone responsible for it, at least gives some stress-reducing attributes built around understanding causality. If on top of that, you believe there is not only something out there responsible for all of this, but that there is a larger purpose to it, that's another level of stress-reducing explanation. If then on top of it, you believe that individual out there is benevolent, even more so, control and predictability. Benevolent and listens to human entreaties, more elements of control. Benevolent listens to human entreaties and prefers to listen to people like you, who look like you, pray like you, request like you, even more so. They're just all these levels of control, predictability, they're stress reducing. And what is infuriating to me as an utter, complete atheist is a very, very solid literature showing the health benefits of religiosity. Independent of, you tend to get a social supportive community when you're religious, you have fewer lifestyle risk factors. The mere ability to perceive causality, reason, benevolence especially for people like me, if I say the right combination of words and fervently believe in it, that's wonderfully protective, and there's health benefits to it. If it is a totally heartless, indifferent, apathetic universe out there, you are far more at risk for all the logical things, which is to conclude it is an utterly depressing universe out there. Rates of depression are much higher among atheists, go figure. So in terms of that, it makes perfect sense why this is something that people have come up with. And rather than asking why is it that 95% of humans come up with some form of religiosity, much more biologically interesting question to me is what's up with the 5% of atheists who don't do that?
All right, welcome to Social Distillation, the submarine still of the internet, where we attempt to drop the bead and pour white lightning straight onto your brain. Today's white lightning is theological and philosophical, as you might have guessed
from the cold open.
Mr. Big Brain Sapolski and his thoughts there. It's interesting that you came up with that, unbeknownst to me, because one of my thoughts that I was going to get into is that not that long ago, the YouTube space was heavily populated by snarky, edgy atheists who showed off their smarts by arguing with young Earth creationists. And you've got Berlinski's book up there, which hopefully we won't get off on too much of a tangent there, but
I just thought it was a fitting book since this is the conversation.
And a lot of his book, and where I think he does get a little sidetracked, is he kind of goes back and forth between talking about, as Sapolsky put it, religiosity in general, and directly countering what's his bucket, brain fart, the God delusion.
Dawkins.
I kept wanting to say Darwin. He does get into that too, but specifically Dawkins, because I think Berlinski finds offense, himself a secular Jew, and an atheist, grew up a secular Jew, but as a philosopher and a mathematician, I think he takes offense to the idea that because someone else believes in God, that person is delusional. which is where I think Dawkins just, jumps the shark, is that, oh, well, you must be delusional because the wholly rational position is the scientific position, the atheistic position. And as Sapolski points out, the more interesting question from a psychological, from an anthropological point of view is not the 95% of delusional people, but what's going on with the other 5.
Well, and I also, my brain went there when you started wanting to have this conversation, because unlike the Berlinski, Dawkins, Harris, even to some degree Hitchens conversations, there's like an animosity that goes there. Whereas Sapolski is, I would love to understand this. I haven't been able to jump that bridge, but I would love to understand it. And I've always, and this is something we've always had in personal conversations, where you got to be open to the conversation, or else you're just an asshole. And so that's on the atheistic side. They tend to be assholes, because they're like, oh, you're an idiot because you have to believe in this thing that doesn't exist. But on the other side, what my experience is when people find out, so like I said, watch this at your own risk if you have a certain opinion of me. But when people do find out that I have absolutely no faith in anything supernatural, they say they want to talk, but they don't want to talk, they want to preach. And as soon as I start giving my side of the story, it derails the whole conversation, because they don't want to listen to that. They just want to preach the gospel to you. They don't know, most people aren't versed in discussion about the topics at hand.
I think there's also, when you come to wholly believe in something, there's this this really narrow focus to your understanding that you almost instinctively think that, oh, other people don't believe this because they just don't know. You assume a lack of information. It's one of the reasons an atheist, a CrossFitter, and a vegan walk into a bar. How do you know? Because they told you.
Which is, I guess that is the difference, because I hardly ever tell anybody.
Yeah. And it's one of the reasons we end up talking about some of the fad diets when we talk fitness, is because it's constantly in your face, because people just assume, oh, you just don't know this stuff, or else you would be carnivore, you would be vegan, you would be keto, whatever. And no, I know this stuff. I understand. I just disagree. I just have a different point of view.
Well, and when you get down to somebody's beliefs, and we're going to use that word is going to be, for the rest of this conversation, someone's inherent desire for something to be true. Not that it is true, not that they've had sufficient evidence. We'll go with a different term for that, but their belief that they're holding on to, like you said, in diets, any level of evidence will do. The diet people, the Whole30 people. Oh, you roll an orange across the room and it loses half of its vitamin C. Well, okay, how do you know that? Why, the doctor that told me blah 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 rolled the orange across the room and then squished it, and you could see that it was different. I'm like, okay, slightly bruised, but where did the vitamin C go? It's matter. It has to go somewhere. Should I lick the floor?
Man, I've heard some dumb ones, but I've never heard that one. That's a doozy.
It was from a person selling vitamins, so because you have to get your vitamins.
Oy vey. Yeah, that says a lot right there.
Okay, so this is going to seem unrelated, but it's not. So Coleman Hughes made a post today on Twitter. He watched a movie here recently, And the movie, has anybody seen the advertisements for the movie Amsterdam?
Yeah, I've seen the trailers. It looks
Okay.
like my kind of movie. I just have no desire to
Well,
pay to go see it in the theater.
his tweet was, Amsterdam feels like a movie written in 15 minutes on a Coke bender. So later on, he tweets, and I kind of went over that. I was like, ha ha ha, knowing exactly what he was talking about, knowing that there was a movie called Amsterdam, and the context of the sentence makes you believe it's about a movie. He tweets later on, I thought the words Amsterdam feels like a movie would make it clear that I was referring to a movie called Amsterdam. But boy, did these replies prove me wrong. Silly me. So I went and looked through the replies, and it was like, oh, you should visit here while you're there. And you should, oh, I didn't know you were going on vacation. Blah, 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 blah. This is the majority of people we're dealing with. So
there's some context there, people.
then you add belief to it, and a deep down ingrained belief, especially since childhood. And and the want to is enough evidence that anything is there.
Yeah, and we see this we see this amongst the new Puritans who act like the people they used to denounce. I didn't realize Nick Rekieta had gotten banished from polite society, and all because he made a comment that was deemed to be attacking this person's worldview, and they went on a rampage. And
there were some euphemisms in his comment that I can see being slightly threatening. If now Viva went over it, and apparently in context he makes those euphemisms about everything in his whole show.
Yes,
like it's like a 5-year thing where anything that he doesn't like, he says these things that I'm not going to say because they got him banned. But they imply, basically, they could imply violence if you took it the wrong way.
I think didn't Joe Rogan get canceled a while back for saying basically the same thing of, I don't care what you do with it, do as an adult, but should we be doing this to children? Which was the origination. Now there was other stuff that happened subsequently, because Nick Rekieta isn't the kind of person to just sit back and take it. And
yeah,
so
it was his response
counterpunched
to the response.
Yeah.
It was he made a statement like you just said. Some person had took offense to it and made their statements, which apparently weren't threatening at all, although I saw them and they were quite overtly threatening. And then he made a response with these euphemisms in it that was what got him banned.
And every time this happens, it really is. I can't think of a single instance where the person under attack and being canceled actually said something legitimately inflammatory. It was kind of pushing back on the worldview of the people doing the canceling. It's you just nudge them ever so slightly, and you are attacking their person. You are negating their existence. No, I'm not. I'm disagreeing with you. Or even not necessarily disagreeing with you even wholeheartedly, but offering a caveat to what you said, yeah, but, and even that is not acceptable. And I can't remember who did it, as an Irish comedian recently. I was listening to an interview, wrote a book, and I think it's called The New Puritans, about cancel culture and how these people are acting like, and these are mostly people of the far left who have long been the people denouncing rigid conservative Christians as close-minded, as bigots, etc., and so forth. And they like to point to things like the Puritans, like the Salem witch trials. And okay, and what are you doing here? How is what you're doing different and better? Oh, because you're on the side of the angels. That's why.
Yeah, and that's why I don't like to go down that route of, well, look at the Inquisition. Oh, look at the Holy Wars, or look at the Salem witch trials, because those were inherently justified using religious texts. rightfully or wrongfully, that's a different discussion, but
Mhm.
they were bad people doing bad things, and they used a text to justify it.
They also ignore that oftentimes when those things were stopped, they were stopped by other Christians
Mhm.
using the Bible to say, no, you're wrong, at great expense to themselves sometimes. So look at the abolitionist movement, and the white abolitionists who were murdered because of their stance, which was a Christian stance, which was using the Bible to counter the Southern pro-slavery ministers who were saying, no, see, this verse here says we're justified in what we're doing.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew Doyle does a good breakdown in the Salem witch trials, but the interesting thing about those is basically all the shenanigans that were going on in Salem, it finally kind of got out, and there was this whole hierarchy of magistrates with these parishioners, and all of the others were like, wait
You're
a
doing
minute,
what now?
no
Yeah.
bueno. So all of us are saying stop it, and it just stopped. It basically just stopped, and everybody went on their with their lives.
Mm-hmm. Well, except the poor people got killed.
Yeah,
But
well, yep, except for
other than that,
um,
but that's our kind of rambling setting the stage here.
Yeah, you wanted to go into why you wanted to do this and what took you so long to prepare for it.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I've said what I needed to say, because, hey, I'm an atheist. All right, but, whatever you want to call it, agnostic, or however you judge it by the basis of this conversation. And I do love to have theological conversations as long as we keep it civil, and you like to hear where I come from, and your mind is open. Not you specifically, Heath, but anybody that talks to me, your mind is open to hear these things that make you uncomfortable. Because a lot of the things I'm going to say make people uncomfortable who are religious.
And as we have said in talking about intellectual things as well as physical things, you need to get comfortable being uncomfortable, because that's how you grow. Tomorrow is heavy leg day, and I'm going to be very uncomfortable, but I have to make myself do it because I'm slowly rebuilding that, that base of strength back. But there was a theological reason why I was procrastinating so much. And so for anyone who doesn't know, which would be everybody but Sam here, I grew up going to church every Sunday. Even after leaving home, I continued to do that. Like a lot of things in my youth, I went over the deep end a little bit with it, and then kind of fell off and wandered around and tried to figure out, okay, who am I? Where am I? What do I believe? Why do I believe? And then, okay, what do I do about it? And one of the things that has long bothered me, one of the passages that has long bothered me, has been in the Matthew chapter 7 verse 22.
You can share a screen if you're going to need to.
There's the button. Okay. So this website's really good for anyone who wants to do some study. I will say their interface isn't very intuitive. If on the off chance that we ever get big enough that someone associated with this site hears about it, but I love the site. I don't love the interface because it took me a while to remember how to do something I'd done a while back when I was on this site. But for every verse, you can pull up commentaries, and you can have them parallel. So you've got all of these different commentaries on this single verse. So you can really go down a rabbit hole on, okay, well, what does this verse mean? Or what have other people thought about this verse, and how will that help my thinking of it? But so Matthew chapter 7, and you have to keep this in the context of, I believe this is part of the Sermon on the Mount, but this is a long passage of Jesus speaking about a lot of different things. And he gets to kind of judgment, talking about judgment. This is part of the oft used and abused and misused. Judge not lest ye be judged. This follows shortly after that. Many will say to me on that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? And there's another, I think it may be a similar verse in, I think, Luke, where it even goes further of healed the sick and raised the dead. And that verse is always kind of stuck in my mind when it comes to what does it take to be a saved Christian? Because I've never cast out any demons so far as I know. I've certainly never healed the sick, unless you count going to the store to get some NyQuil. And I've definitely never raised the dead. So it's terrifying to see Jesus himself saying to people who will say this, depart from me, I know ye not. And that has always stuck with me until I found Dennis Prager's Rational Bible series. And he starts with Exodus. I don't know why. I don't know if that's a Jewish thing, if someone's Jewish and could tell me why he started with Exodus instead of Genesis. Maybe it's just more important because it's when the law was given. I don't know. But he started with Exodus, and when I was reading through this, there was kind of a bolt of lightning moment when I got to Exodus 20 verse 7, which is part of the Ten Commandments, the giving of the Ten Commandments. And so there's the verse here: thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain. And you can go round and around of, okay, well, what does this mean? And if you go through these commentaries, the consensus seemed to be, because a lot of these commentaries are centuries old, of most like this one, most modern critics regard the phrase used as forbidding false swearing, but some think that it also forbids also profane or vain swearing. So taking the Lord's name in vain is about swearing an oath in the name of God. But of course, others, especially American Christians, have taken that to be just using the name God in any way that is not, religiously focused is damnable. And
I mean, I know this is not where you're going, but the way I read that, wouldn't that only be applicable if you don't hold to your oath? So
yes,
if I swear to God, but I keep my promise,
and
that's not in vain.
And some of these other commentaries bring up like later verses like in Leviticus or Deuteronomy where it specifically spells out the punishment for bearing false witness, and they tie those verses together, because in a legal proceeding, you are swearing under God that you are going to give true testimony. And if you don't, there are specific prescriptions under Jewish law of what happens to you. And so that is part of it. And so it is a little weird. And I think it's a bit of the weirdness of the English language because of the way words can kind of morph over time. And specifically, it's the take that we use that word in a lot of varied ways. And so to take the Lord's name in vain is to use the Lord's name in vain, which seems weird, but that's how the English language works.
What you could also say, to take the Lord's name would be to call yourself God.
You're actually accidentally getting close to, so Prager is a legit Jewish scholar. He speaks biblical Hebrew, which isn't the same as modern Hebrew. It's an archaic version. So he understands biblical Hebrew, and he uses a translation in his book of "You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name," is the translation he uses. And he says, while the translation being used in this Torah commentary is that of the Jewish Publication Society 1962, and one with which I sometimes disagree, though I hold it in very high regard, in this instance, I believe the JPS translation is far off the mark. Indeed, I greatly prefer the older version of the 1917 JPS translation. "Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless that taketh his name in vain." Swearing falsely in God's name, this translation, is much more narrow in understanding of this commandment than taking the name of the Lord in vain. Moreover, the word swear is not used. So what then does this commandment prohibit? And then he goes into a long essay. The worst sin is committing evil in God's name. And he asks, is there such a thing as the worst sin? And in this context, yes, that's what he's saying, is that
So all of those outliers we were talking about earlier were actually not biblical because they were doing evil in his name.
exactly. And that was the bolt of lightning moment. Is when I read this, I immediately connected it to Matthew 7. And it says that, did we not do this in your name? Okay, well, you could do it in his name. Was it really in his name? Or were you just declaring it so? Were you just saying it so? And so he goes into what how he translates this based on the verbs used. The Lord will not hold him guiltless. Literally, God will not cleanse. So God will not forgive. And this is the only instance where that is in the Bible. It is said that God will. Jeffrey Dahmer supposedly had a deathbed conversion. All right. Well, if it was genuine, God will forgive that. He won't forgive this. Okay. But then what is this? So he points out that he also found it odd that American Christians have the idea that if you said, "God, I had a bad day today," somehow that's an unforgivable sin. That's a terrible sin. As he points out, for one thing, the word God is not God's name. It's his title, which I hadn't really thought of before. God's name is Yahweh, and it's spelled capital YHVH. We do not know exactly how it is pronounced, and Jews refrain from pronouncing it. It is this name in the original Hebrew we are forbidden to say in vain, and that's elsewhere. So anyway, he gets down to the verb that is used and is often translated take, is not what the commandment actually says. The Hebrew verb in the commandment, tissa, means carry. The commandment therefore reads, "Do not carry God's name in vain." And who carries God's name in vain? Any person who claims to be acting in God's name while doing the opposite of what God wants. And so that made me go, in a lot of ways. And one of them was to be very cautious about proselytizing, unless I am certain. I find it much easier to say that's heretical. That's contrary to the Bible. Maybe I'll make the two viewers we have mad, but Mormonism is heretical. It is contrary to the Bible. Plain face. I've yet to find someone who belongs to the Church of Latter-day Saints who can explain to me how you can justify the Book of Mormon with Galatians chapter 1. And there's a whole bunch of other things, but that's the big one to me. I don't have a problem saying that. I don't have a problem arguing with my Catholic friends that I find the hierarchy of the church, of the Catholic Church, the Pope and all that, to be contrary to the Bible. What I can't say is, and so you're going to hell. That is a judgment that I am inserting on my own. It's not there. I cannot point to you a verse to say that. In fact, I can point to you some verses that say I can't make that call. That specifically say I can't make that call. But that's on the negative side. On the positive side, I feel from what Prager's laying out here with this, the third commandment and the 10 commandments, that
I just had this vision in my head of religious protests and then a religious counter protest to the religious protest. You're going to hell, and then you're on the other side saying you can't say that.
Yeah.
And then you have a Bible verse under you can't say that. Sorry,
Uh-huh.
that was just the thought that flew through my head.
Yeah, that's my John 3:16 moment sign, I guess. I don't know. But so it's much easier to say that because there are places where things are pretty definitive in black and white. But when it comes to the positive, I feel I need to be a little more careful with that. Like, we have had discussions where I talk about my personal conception of what hell is. I would be very leery of saying that out loud in public, because it needs to be understood. This is my supposition based on these things. I am not saying this is right. I am not saying this is accurate. I'm not saying this is biblical. I don't know. I'm saying I think this. So when we go through things, I'm actually going to want to start at the beginning, using Nahum Sarna, who is a renowned Jewish scholar who wrote this book back in the 60s, which makes me mad because it's so good, and yet we're still having these same damn arguments. But it makes me leery of speaking too assertively, unless to me it is clear that the text is black and white, and cannot be misunderstood. If it is unclear, then I'm going to try my best to make that point of, well, I think this connects to that. I think this means that. And that is why I've kind of been procrastinating and taking a while to get to this.
Since the 1990s, we knew that this is probably the right number for, at least on the low end, for protein consumption per day, but still the RDA is half that. And all these fat dietitians that pimp the Mediterranean diet, which is about half of that, still fight with us. In fact, the mainstream answer is the one that's not been studied. But
the nutrition section of one of my certifications, I don't remember which, said you don't need more than 10% of your calories to come from protein.
Well, what if I eat 5,000 calories a day? I hate the percentage method just because of that.
Yeah.
Why do I need less protein if I reduce my calories to lose weight? Why do I need more protein if I increase my calories to gain weight? My body can only use so much of it. But the point of that was, you said this was written in the 1960s, but yet you're still fighting about it. I'm like, well, look at this. This is something that's mainstream, and our government has advice for us, and it's still being argued about. And this was from 30 years ago.
Well, the tangent is actually not a tangent, because it is applicable to where I was going, which is that one of the other reasons I was procrastinating is because I wasn't sure how to do it and where to begin to have a Sunday school time. And that's why I was going to talk about the snarky, edgy atheists on YouTube, is that I've heard some people say that if you're going to read the Bible, you shouldn't start at the beginning. I'm actually inclined to disagree with that, because so much of the contrary opinion is that the Bible is anti-science or the Bible isn't rational because of the creation myth.
Well, I think I know where that came from. What you shouldn't start from the beginning, because so much I'm gonna put in air quotes, the conversion process is finding people down on their luck and picking them up and out of it and bringing in the born agains. And to start at the beginning, you're just going to depress them more.
Old Testament's pretty
But if you start with
Old Testament,
if you start with the John 3:16, which everybody memorizes day one, you know, it's usually the only verse that born again can give you, but it's uplifting because, oh my God, did I just in vain? Sorry. You look at it and you're like, wow, my life isn't that bad because God loves me. And so that's the ultimate message you're trying to pull them into. God loves you no matter what. Now let's get you out of your funk. And
yeah. And I've had that discussion a while back with the Pat Peterson, the preacher at my parents' church in the Church of Christ in Clinton, Oklahoma. They're on YouTube. Go watch his sermons if you want. He's great. But we kind of went around in a circle with that going, so where would you start? And I think we kind of decided that in the circumstance you're talking about for people like that, you should probably start with the Gospel of John because you need the Jesus story if you're going to convert to be a follower of Jesus. And then that leads you into Acts where you can learn about the methods and the preaching that came from the man Jesus, and then that leads you into Romans, which, you know, helps you with all the dirty thoughts in your mind, you sinner, because that's what a lot of Romans is about. So if you start with those three, you've got a pretty
the
good
Romans
comprehension.
themselves would have been a good place to start with that. You could probably go back to the Athenians before that, but Jesus wasn't around for the Athenians, so
and that is, you know.
Well, but the other part about starting in the beginning is so much of the Old Testament is meaningful in a very abstract way. Deep down life lessons that aren't Jesus loves you. This is how this is the rule book you should go by. It's this happened in the Garden of Eden. This happened with Cain and Abel. This happened through Moses's life. And every one of these events has meaning to it. But you don't just get that just by just reading it like a book.
Well, and it's you have to understand, and this is why it's so eye-rolling when people use the old events of the Old Testament to discredit Christianity because there's terrible stuff in the Old Testament. Yeah, because it was the Bronze Age, man. That was a rough time. Nowhere do these terrible things that happened that people like to bring up, like David. King David is lauded as one of the greatest and most God-fearing and pious men of the whole Old Testament. He committed adultery with one of his officers' wives, got her pregnant, and then
let's set a little backdrop. This is a guy who committed adultery in the most difficult possible situation to commit adultery because he had multiple wives.
He had multiple wives and concubines, and yet he sees this woman bathing, lusts after her, but she's married, so he can't make her one of his wives. Her husband is an officer and a devout follower of King David, and so his solution, it's such a great human story. And if you have a twisted sense of humor like me, you kind of chuckle at parts. So his first thought is, well, let me bring him back from the front lines and then try and get him to sleep with his wife so he thinks the kid is his. Except he won't, because he refuses to have those comforts while his men are suffering in the field. Crap. So he sends him back to the front lines with a letter to the general saying, put him at the front of the hottest fighting so that he will be killed. He's not lauded for that. In fact, the prophet of God comes and says, you're a terrible person and you've done wrong, and your child is going to die because of it, because you have done something so terrible. It's giving you humanity with all of its warts. Because, well, first of all, I think because to do otherwise would have been silly. You know, we first world problems here. We can have a church that preaches prosperity gospel, that preaches that God wants you and Jesus wants you to be happy and successful and awesome, because we live in a world where we have very little struggle that we don't invent for ourselves. You know, we in the first world, in this world. That kind of message would have been absurd to the people of the Bronze Age, because they lived in a very, very nasty world.
Yeah, civil wars over chariots.
Yeah. So,
as we talked about last time.
That was the Iron Age, but still the point holds.
Yeah, Iron Age wasn't much better, just sharper weapons.
Nope. There's a reason why scientific advancement happened so fast, because that was part of it. But if you look at the great scientists of old, they were wealthy people because you had to be. It was the great English scientists were almost all aristocrats, because they were the only ones that had the time to do it.
Yeah, you don't sit behind your plow with your ox pulling it, thinking about the lever and the spring and this that you're going to, your plow in your field. You're not thinking that sun, that's not going around me. We might be going around it.
Exactly. It takes leisure time to be able to have these extraneous thoughts.
Well, and coming from a scientific background, you also need the luxury of being able to fail and still be alive.
Yes.
Most of science is failure. So
and so much of life for so much of history was being just trying to survive. And that's, kind of spoiler alert of where I'm going to go when we start to get into the beginning of Genesis, is that is where Genesis is a very rational document, because it is a combination of history and fable to teach these kinds of lessons in this very harsh world and transform humanity into something different and something better. And that's where just reading the introduction by Nahum Sarna is so annoying, because he several times makes the point, and again, this was published in I think 1962, that all manner of academic pursuits have led to a doubting of the Bible, of people saying, see, this proves. And so you had this reflexive counter argument by biblical people of, well, that's just wrong. The young earthers are the obvious ones, are the obvious targets. And he mentions those kinds of people, and he finds that absurd. He finds that silly.
You're going to have to define terms, because I'm not familiar with young earthers.
Okay, so that's a good point. I thought they had been so made fun of that most people knew who that was. Young Earth are the people who say that carbon dating isn't a thing.
Okay, that's what I guessed by it, but I wanted to clarify.
They're
the 6,000-year-old Earth people.
by using the genealogies in the Bible and the ages given at times, that we can calculate that the Earth is only 6,000 years old, roughly. They have an exact number, but I don't care. So roughly 6,000 years old. Sarna finds that not just that, but all of the elements of that absurd. So like one of the non-scientific ones, one of the more in the humanities side, is there's been a lot of comparative literature study that say, oh, well, the Bible isn't really the inspired word of God. It's just stolen or borrowed. So for instance, the flood of Noah was just taken from the Epic of Gilgamesh. Okay, because there are other flood stories in that area, in the Near East, in Mesopotamia, in that area. And Sarna counters that no, that actually strengthens the claims of the Bible, because it took these ideas and transformed them into something new. And I think that is an interesting and, to my mind, correct way of thinking about it. That the core of the Bible, starting at the beginning, starting with the creation story, is in order for humanity to eventually evolve into something that is not so brutish, they have to start thinking and acting differently. And the law of Moses, the structure of society laid out in the Torah, is profoundly different from the way anyone else was living at the time.
Well, to me, that also coincides with another major world event where we transferred from tribal societies to agricultural societies. And if you think of things kind of that way, so much of the biblical path, I should say, when it comes to how you should live and what life should be for everybody in general, it's almost like a teaching tool to go to an agricultural society, which is one of my issues, because when you talk universal truths, they need to be universal. And a lot of the truths, quote unquote, in the Bible that are wise and great words for us, because we live in agricultural, Western, urban, mixed rural societies, it works. But if you go to, tribal Western Ethiopia, you got to throw half of this shit out, because it's not the best way to live. You would perish.
Ethiopia is maybe not the best example, since they claim they have the Ark into the Covenant, so they might take offense at that.
I'm talking about specific tribes there that have a certain way of doing things.
Yeah. That is something I had not considered and thought of, so I'll have to put some thought into that as we go forward, and you can point out where you think those pop up, because I do find them to be universal, obviously, because if I didn't, I wouldn't adhere to them, or at least try to adhere to them as best I can. Because otherwise, what's the point? And I think I've shared this before, of that was something interesting that I heard Penn Jillette say years ago, when he was talking with Glenn Beck, who is good friends with, which a lot of people find very, very weird. But no, that's just an example of how people who profoundly disagree can still be friends.
Yeah. In real life, people are still friends when they.
Exactly. That's how life is supposed to work. But Beck kind of did one of these things, like I was mentioning earlier, the lack of understanding problem, because he couldn't understand why someone who thought so deeply, Beck couldn't understand how Gillette, who is someone who thought so deeply and understood human nature so well, that how he could then be an atheist, not only understand human nature, but understand a lot of religiosity. and not in the caricature kind of way that someone obnoxiously snarky like Bill Maher understands religiosity. No, he truly understands it. And Penn Jillette said, paraphrasing here, that because belief is an affirmative action, it is not passive. It is something you have to proactively do. And he doesn't have that conviction. He doesn't have that level of belief to be able to proactively do that. And I was trying not to laugh when I thought of it, because it's really not right, but we have a very wrong sense of humor. It's kind of like you and homosexuality, what you say to gay guys of, hey, if I'm ever sexually attracted to a guy, I have no problem with it. I'll do it. But it hadn't happened in 40 years yet. Probably not going to happen. And that's kind of how Penn Jillette was with religiosity, with, Christianity or some form of theology. Of, to him, it is an intellectual exercise like any other philosophy. If he ever reaches the point where he can proactively act upon these ideals, then he'll stop being an atheist.
Mm-hmm. If I was to guess what's going on in his head there, it would be something to the extent of, if I could say a prayer and actually mean it without that voice in the back of my head saying, okay, you can give it a try, but that's kind of what's going on in there, because there's just that part of you that's like, you really even believe this? And to your homosexual analogy there, I have also said, if I ever am in that moment where I actually truly believe something, then I'll make that leap. But it hasn't happened here in quite some time. And the only time it seemed close was, like I said, when you're pulling somebody out of, nothingness, like you and your family did. And it was more of a sense of belonging than it was anything else. So it turned out to be. And there's something to be said about that. I mean, that was part of the video right there.
That was the whole point of opening with Sapolski there, and where, Jordan Peterson has been talking about Old Testament stories and looking at them from a psychology and an anthropology point of view. He has a very interesting series of lectures on those, if anyone hasn't watched those yet. And where I think the whole edgy atheist, well, partly because they ate their own, because they started getting eaten by the woke culture, because it was no longer enough to just be atheist. You
atheist plus.
Exactly.
And as we always say, you added a cross to atheism.
Yeah. So that is
even
also
a leaning plus sign. So it's.
But I think that helped a lot of the people who were sympathetic to the movement to realize, oh, wait a minute, you have to have something. And even if I don't believe it, society needs it, or else you get this, which is the utter nonsense we have right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. I still don't, I'm still on the fence about the whole God-shaped hole thing, though, because that's the whole argument for why the atheist movement brought in the woke ideology so much, because I just don't feel it. I don't feel this missing thing. It's like, well, maybe I do feel it with other things, but they're all worldly. It's family, it's, being a parent, it's being a friend, it's all of those things that encompass your day every day, all day. And maybe there is meaning behind that's deeper, and I'm sure there is, but at the same time, this whole, well, you don't believe in God, you're going to end up falling down some other rabbit hole. I just don't. It's never. I have trouble putting that much belief into anything, which is why I think this channel came through, because I can't believe in anything, so I have to question everything. And turns out we've been right most of the time on a lot of other things by questioning. So
I would suspect the God-shaped hole people would say that is what you're filling it with, is your moral connection to family and community. Just guessing though, because I'm not one of those people. But that is and kind of the reason I suspect that is because that is, as I kind of tease, that's where I'm going when we start, I consider this episode 0, when we get to the first episode and actually start talking about Genesis and creation and the stories of that, of why it's important. And it's a societal cultural thing that I do think there is an individual element to it, but I do think that Christianity is much more individualistic, leading to the betterment of the whole. But when you look at the lessons being taught in the Old Testament stories, I think that's much more societally focused, which makes sense because you have a chosen people, a called nation that is God's people of Israel. So it would make sense that the focus then would be more on transforming society as a whole, and then that affecting the individual to better behavior. And so that's definitely a major component of that God-shaped whole. Mm-hmm. is the connection. And that's kind of what Sapolski was talking about, was that connection, that belonging, that it's not just that you have this being out there somewhere who cares about you and you can petition and all of that, but that you and your circle of friends and family and the people you go to church or synagogue or whatever with all have that together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. All of those stress relieving things, I mean, I have found a lot of those secularly. Like we've got the free will versus consciousness debate. And if you kind of I say believe, if you follow that kind of train of thought, it's actually quite relieving. It's quite stress relieving, because realistically, one of the best things I've ever heard from somebody, I can't remember the guy's name, but he was talking about your judgment of other people. He said that what I always tell myself is I would make the same decision if I was that person at that exact moment, right? Well, you can say the same thing about yourself, because say you did something that was stupid. It's going forward that's where consciousness comes in, and it feels like free will, because you change how you do things as you go forward, but it's based on that thing you already did, which you did based on the things you did before, which you did based on the things you did before, plus your genetics, plus your epigenetics, plus your environment, plus all of those other things. So it's relieving in the fact that I can look back at that stupid thing I did and say, you know what, I'd do the same thing if I was me at that exact moment again. But I'm not me in that exact moment, so everything's future forward. Everything's future facing. So you can learn from your mistakes without dwelling on them and waking up in the middle of the night because of that stupid thing you said in second grade. Right?
Yeah.
It's quite stress relieving.
Most of my stupid things were because of boobies, but that's another show.
I mean, so. We're dudes. We're cis heteronormative dudes. So to use the modern lingo,
should we apologize for that?
Yeah, we apologize.
Right. Well,
there's a little sarcasm when I do stuff like that.
On that note, that's all I have for this episode, and I really have to pee. So unless you have anything else.
Nope, I got to get back to work outside. That puts us right at about an hour, which is pretty good for our Sunday school. Well, we'll probably mix it up on Saturdays. Sunday school sometimes sexy time with Sam. That'd probably be a good time to have our fitness talks, considering how we structured things lately.
Yeah, and unless we just can't stand the news and want to talk fitness on Thursday because the news is awful.
Yeah, well, I know I dropped the ball a little bit on Thursday because I was a little out of it and tired. I know you wanted me. I started with that whole mother is your first in-group thing because we were going to talk oxytocin and how that plays into, tribalism and how it goes around. So I dropped the ball on that, and there were some other things that I know you kind of wanted me to go into. Why is tribalism beneficial from an evolutionary standpoint? Probably things like that I was just out of it, and we're on day 8 of sober October. And that makes 8 days longer than I normally go without a drink. So it's getting better, but it's still weird.
All right. Well, keep us updated on how that goes, and we will see y'all folks next time, Tuesday, talking more Fires of Heaven. I think we get back to Rand's storyline now.
Yes. So I got to wear the cowboy hat because that means Matt's in there.
Yeehaw.
Yeehaw.